Thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. Firstly, many thanks to MacGill and particularly Joe for inviting me back to contribute. There's been some controversy this year, of course, and as I am the only woman on the panel, I thought I might use it to inform some of what I'm about to talk about today. Can we maintain strong growth and a healthy economy? There are indeed many risks facing us in the economy, but it's worth bearing in mind that over the course of 100 years in one Irish family, my own, as seen through the lens of the matriarchal line, Irish economic policy has vastly improved the lives of ordinary people in this country. When facing the shorter-term immediacy of annual budgets, minority governments, and imminent or not general elections, we can lose sight of their impact. But in the last 100 years, fundamental government economic policies have vastly improved our lives. And this is also a direct challenge to us today. Was it a golden age, as Danny has said? Will the decisions of the next 100 years reflect as well on the current powers and keen economic minds, elected or otherwise? How will history judge us? So what is the story of the women of my mother's family over the course of the 20th century? My grandmother, Catherine Fields, was born in 1904 to a coal miner on her birth cert and a woman listed only as his wife. Catherine was born in Scotland. Her parents were there for work, but returned to Ireland as a very young girl. By the time of the 1911 census, much to the general hilarity of her current descendants, age 7, she is listed as a scholar. Her family is living in a Dublin tenement in the inner city. She is a scholar because neither of her parents can sign their name on the census. They are both recorded for posterity with an X. Catherine grew up and married and moved to newly built social housing in Cabra. My mother was born in 1939, and 10 years after she was born, Catherine died at the age of 45. She left 3 girls who were reared by their paternal grandmother, who moved into the family home. As a child, of course, I had visions of a rosy-cheeked woman baking apple tarts. But it turns out that Grandma, as my mother called her, spent most of her time in bed, and I suppose my mother, the eldest, would today be called a carer, a child carer. So Olive was bright, and although she wanted to be a teacher, when she was offered a position as a clerical officer in the OPW, the nun's advice to my grandfather, a working man, was that she was a pretty girl who would soon be married. Off she went. And pretty soon indeed, the marriage bar put an end to her burgeoning career as a civil servant. Olive kept all the rules asked of women in those times, and 5 children and 9 house moves later from my father's career, she finally got to college to study English and Italian. But by now it was the 1980s, and teaching jobs for newly qualified teachers in their 40s were few and far between. One of her daughters, that would be me, qualified as an accountant in 1991 at the age of 23, along with her intended, sitting in the audience now as a middle-aged, grumpy old married man. In just over a year, we saved 10% of the price of our first house, with no help from the bank of mum and dad, a phenomenon totally unknown back then. I started my career in the nascent IFSC in a company whose first operation outside the US was in Ireland. And here I am now today at these heady heights to give my thoughts on Ireland's economic choices for the immediate term, and I still hazard that I know something of what it is like to be a woman in a man's world. That my family has gone in 100 years from unable to sign their names on a census to quarrels over dinner about which of my sisters is the real doctor, the medical consultant, or the university professor, I have no dog in that fight, thankfully, is an unrivaled economic and social success story in women's lives, and I tell it to you now to illustrate that Ireland's economic policy decisions have gotten much right, and that is maybe only ever best seen over a distance. But make no mistake, economically, social housing, free education, membership of the EU, participation of women in the workforce, immigration and worker mobility, childcare, healthcare, FDI, corporation tax rates, bank lending rules, and more generally, the allowance and reward for personal endeavour all feature strongly in my story. Ireland has much to be proud of in some of the decisions it has made in the broad arc of 100 years of women's lives that allows me to stand here on the shoulders of Catherine Fields, daughter of a migrant coal miner who died aged 45. If those economic changes over the last 100 years have been immense, as the world stands now, there is no reason to believe that those of the next 100 will not be equally so. But what choices do we need to make to ensure that those changes work for our society and so that they will benefit the aspirational classes to which my family can so readily identify? A term I first heard used by a banker friend of mine, and I am not sure it was intended as a compliment. So if you are to take the headline figures from any recent report on the Irish economy, it cannot but give you a healthy view. Low inflation, low unemployment, fastest growing economy in Europe, burgeoning tax coffers, record stock market levels, and net migration possible for Irish emigrants who choose to return. It is often easy to criticise our political system, and it is certainly far from perfect, but credit is deserved for the tough decisions made to turn the economy around. If you were to suggest even a few short years ago that our economy would perform such a turnaround in this time frame, you might have been mocked. We can be proud that Ireland, and the minority in Europe, has dealt with and endured significant so-called austerity without a dramatic ideological shift to the extremes of left or particularly right. And although we are not immune to populist decisions, we have, to a greater or lesser extent, maintained a shaky enough hold on that much maligned middle ground. At some level, this can be interpreted as confidence of the majority in our political system, and it must be taken as yet another broad positive for our country and for our society. While some tough decisions have been made by our politicians, it is also true that a lot of Ireland's current recovery and success is a direct result of Ireland being a very open economy, which has benefited more than most from the recovery elsewhere, and from global quantitative easing and ultra-low interest rates at a time when debt levels here were very elevated, and still are. While the ESRI expect 4.7% growth in 2018 and almost 4% in 2019, there are many questions as to what is sustainable over the longer term. As a small open economy, if we have benefited more than most on the way up, it is also true, and will remain so, that we will be disproportionately hit in a global downturn. There are diverse and unprecedented risks facing our economy, and they may or may not materialise, but in my view, it makes sense in economic terms to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. In particular, the twin threats of a hard Brexit on one side and further geopolitical disruption, trade wars, shifts to isolationism on the other, argue strongly for prudence and long-term thinking at this crucial point. So going into Budget 19 season, for want of a better expression, it is more than usually difficult to listen to the auction politics get underway for whatever limited flexibility our public finances suggest. On a macro level, we face global trade tensions, a rise in political extremism, EU fragmentation, political interference, China's growing economic influence without any transparency to what that means or its intentions and ambitions, and the near certainty of a rise in interest rates as QE ends. These changes are occurring at a time when global corporates, particularly in technology, have never had more power, and old business models, even those which have survived generations, are threatened by disruption and, in some cases, irrelevance. Examples are legion: newspapers, credit cards, the diesel petrol engine. Global liberal democracies and Western economies, of which we are finally one, are being disrupted, and what we are seeing and experiencing is the fallout from this disruption. Across Europe, the number of people in work is at the highest level since the introduction of the euro, with 8.4% European unemployment rate. Despite this, there's been a huge rise of populist extremism across the region. It is obvious that a cohort of the population feel disillusioned and frustrated with growing inequality. Here in Ireland, income inequality has been broadly stable over the last 30 years, and as a result, low, middle and high income households have all seen a substantial growth in their incomes. This is in stark comparison to the slow and unequal growth in the UK and the US, which has polarised large portions of the electorate, marginalising many and distributing success very unequally. If we do not regard the US and the UK as current bastions of political or social stability, then it is important that we take heed of what we incentivise and what we invest in. Housing and education need to be prioritised. Given that there is little room for complacency, I believe that rather than stimulating the economy further and risking eroding competitiveness, we should be investing where we can in capital projects and working to identify public policy that will encourage diversification and resilience within the basic model that we operate. What we need is a fit and agile economy that adapts easily to change and is not overexposed to any one tax source or sector. This will ensure we are in the strongest possible position to weather macro events elsewhere and to grow sustainably over the longer term. We must learn from the lessons of the past, whereby we had an over-reliance on narrow tax sources, namely property-related VAT, stamp duty, PAYE from construction workers. This, along with excessive borrowing, caused a double hit to the economy when the asset bubble burst in 2008. In 2007 and 2008, VAT was the largest contributor to the Exchequer, but now personal taxes account for over 40% of the total tax yield, with 1% of income earners contributing 22% of the personal tax take. The bottom 50% of income earners pay just 3.6% of the tax take. While this is a progressive tax system on one level, these figures really do point to a squeezed middle. An individual earning €75,000 a year pays almost 32 times more tax than those earning $18,000. Although unpopular, property tax was introduced successfully in an attempt to diversify tax sources. It has since been let atrophy to the point of unfairness, with the values not updated since introduction and values clearly very different for two neighbours who bought at different times. Similarly, we have water meters at enormous expense, now rusting at every front gate in the country. Further, there are 10 companies in Ireland who account for 40% of the total corporation tax take. I'll come back to that. Any attempt at all to diversify from these stark statistics is welcome. The second strand is then to achieve greater efficiency and transparency for government services. The third is to revisit unfunded state pension promises that simply cannot be kept. Of course, sadly, to articulate all of this as a politician is to render yourself unelectable. So the mindset change from our politicians will only happen with the mindset change from the electorate. Short-term decision-making has not served the country well. We must make and foster a decision-making culture that serves longer-term collective interests and directs economic choices towards the kind of society we would like to see. That will mean tough choices. Other countries can do it, and I believe we can too. It is a truism that a country will get the politics it deserves. In this regard, beware the vested interest groups. When the Troika arrived, one of the things slated as needing radical change was the cost in accessing our legal system. Working in insurance, I find myself regularly defending claims of excessive premiums charged. What should be obvious is that insurance premium levels are a function of cost. Far and away, the main cost of an insurance premium is injury wards and associated legal costs. Why have we proven ourselves incapable of dealing with this? The Troika have been and gone. This was on their list, and yet still all is, as was, in the legal arena. Ireland is an outlier by international comparison in recognising soft tissue injuries and in the level of awards. It is often a one-way bet for the claimant to take a case with the promise of a major windfall if successful and no legal costs if not. All further encourages others to give it a go. In the main, these issues are widely enough understood. So why has it been so slow and so difficult to try and effect change? Also, when I count the re-emergence of tower cranes across the Dublin skyline, 72 at the latest count, we have another tangible sign of recovery. What are all these buildings for? It's obvious they are not residential. We are not attracting the mass exit of financial services companies in the wake of Brexit, but we are attracting knowledge-based companies. Danny has talked about this. They are looking at our corporate tax rate, but they are also attracted here by our skilled workforce, open, diverse, multicultural economy. Knowledge is the new currency, but mainly, did I mention, they are here for our tax rate. While this is a positive development, as I have said, there is one key statistic that surely must worry, and that is that almost 40% of the total corporation tax is paid by just 10 companies. Despite warnings from the Fiscal Council and others, there appears to be no concrete policy steps to broaden and diversify from this. A good place to start would be to look at our Indigenous SME sector, which is a real success story in the Irish economy, and in particular in the rural Irish economy, employing almost 1 million people across Ireland. This is over 70% of jobs in the non-financial sector. We need to nurture and support this area of the economy. The increasing risk of a car crash Brexit and global trade wars will existentially threaten any currently competitive small or medium business that gets caught in the crosshairs. We need economic policy that supports this sector and ensures its future is safeguarded. The agri-food sector is disproportionately exposed to Brexit. Board BIA is to be commended for finding alternative markets, but there is still a serious mismatch in export volume levels, and there is no denying our heavier reliance on the British market for beef, mushroom, chicken subsectors, and nor is dairy immune. Cheddar cheese, of which we export mountains to the UK, is only eaten here and in the United Kingdom. Trying to predict what Brexit arrangements will eventually emerge seems a folly at this stage, but the current brinkmanship suggests the risk of a poor outcome is heightened. If this happens, it will disproportionately hit SMEs, agri-food, farming and rural Ireland. While this government is business friendly, it is essential that industries affected by Brexit receive real support, or we risk losing what has taken generations to build and is a major contributor to our economy outside the capital city. Ensuring Indigenous SMEs, including farming, thrive remains our best opportunity to diversify the corporation tax base. Ireland's economy has proven its ability to reinvent itself and adapt to a changing environment. I'm not suggesting that we move away from the open economy and low corporate tax model. Rather, I am suggesting that we put diversification into the economic policy toolkit and actively promote and broaden income streams that protect us against a global shock. This is just prudent in the face of the current major global risks and the potential for a disproportionate impact on Ireland. Our auction politics has not served us well in the last 20 years. It is time for a longer-term view and a little prudence about near-term risks. I suggest a study of the tale of the ant and the grasshopper might serve us well. It has never really been part of our economic psyche, but it is still as true as it was in ancient Greece. We must have long-term goals and ambitions beyond giving everyone an extra fiver when the good times roll. Our limited fiscal capacity should not be used as an excuse. My grandmother, Catherine Fields, would surely approve. Limited fiscal capacity has never stopped the women of Ireland rearing clatters of kids. In fact, limited fiscal capacity is what made so many Irish mothers ambitious for their children. It has not stopped Ireland's women bettering themselves. It has made us aspirational, and that is a good thing to reward in any economy or society. I think there are probably very few in Ireland who do not share a family history like mine, whether rural or urban. Traced over the broad arc of 100 years, the social and economic lives, the opportunities, the freedoms of Ireland's women are immeasurably better than they were, based on key economic decisions in housing, education and health in our newly formed state. And today's economic choices will have real and lasting impacts on the children born in poverty, in wealth, and in the great middle. We need to remember that and hold on to it when we hear our politicians promise what we cannot afford, and when we hit the ballot box. Thank you.